Snow piles against bark walls. Wind tears through bare trees, like something alive, like something angry. Inside, firelight flickers across dozens of sleeping faces. Children tucked against their mothers. Elders breathing slow and steady. Families pressed shoulder to shoulder on raised wooden platforms, while smoke drifts silently overhead toward the ceiling. Outside, the temperature has dropped below zero. Inside, everyone sleeps warm. This is a Haudenosaunee longhouse in the dead of winter. And what's happening inside these walls is not luck, it's engineering. Most of us panic when the heat goes out for a single night. We reach for our phones, we call someone, we pile on every blanket we own, and still feel the cold creeping in by morning. Now imagine 6 months. No furnace, no insulation, no metal fasteners, no mortar, no modern materials of any kind. Only wood, bark, and rope woven from the forest itself. And not just surviving, but feeding, housing, and keeping warm somewhere between 60 and 100 people through the most brutal season the northeastern woodlands could deliver. That was not a crisis for the Haudenosaunee. That was Tuesday. The structure they built to do this stretched over 200 feet long and sheltered more than 20 families beneath a single curved roof. From mid-October through mid-May, 6 full months, these communities remained essentially sealed inside against the cold. Survival didn't depend on luck or endurance. It depended entirely on architecture. The question isn't whether they built a shelter. Anyone can stack wood and call it shelter. The real question is how they engineered a living system, using only saplings, bark, and hand-twisted cordage, capable of generating heat for 100 people, storing half a year of food, managing toxic smoke from 10 simultaneous fires, and maintaining breathable air, all without a single nail driven into wood. By the time this is over, you'll understand why this building wasn't just a home. It was a government, a refrigerator, and a philosophy. And the fact that we almost forgot it exists is the most remarkable part of the story. To understand how the Longhouse worked, you first have to understand what it was made of, and why every choice of material was a decision, not an accident. The northeastern woodlands were full of massive trees, ancient oaks and chestnuts, with trunks too wide for stone axes to fell efficiently, too heavy for work crews to drag into position. Attempting to build with those giants would have consumed months of labor for a single structure. So the Haudenosaunee didn't. Instead, they looked to the edges of clearings, the places where older trees had fallen or been removed, where younger growth surged upward in competition for sunlight. These second-growth forests produced exactly what they needed: dense stands of straight, slender saplings. Cedar, hickory, and elm, trees between 4 and 8 inches in diameter, sized for human hands. A tree that could be felled, stripped, and shaped in hours rather than weeks. But material selection went deeper than convenience. The frame required 2 opposing properties in the same structure. Vertical posts needed stiffness to bear the roof load without buckling under the weight of heavy winter snow. Rafters needed flexibility, the ability to bend into smooth curves without snapping under tension. Young saplings provided both. The thicker specimens became posts. The thinner, greener ones bent into arches. And here is where the calendar became part of the engineering. Construction happened in late spring and early summer, when sap flowed heavily through the cambium layer beneath the bark. That narrow seasonal window wasn't chosen for comfort. It was chosen because during peak sap flow, 2 things became possible that were impossible at any other time of year. First, the moisture made young saplings pliable enough to bend into the curved roof profile without fracturing the wood fibers. Second, and more critically, the sap pressure allowed builders to harvest bark in massive sheets without killing the donor tree. Elm was preferred above all others. A mature elm during peak sap season could yield panels 3 feet high and 6 feet long, large enough to cover substantial sections of the frame with minimal seams and minimal gaps for cold air to find its way through. The harvesting technique required precision and timing in equal measure. Builders made vertical cuts down the trunk, then horizontal cuts at the top and bottom of the section. During peak flow, the bark layer separated cleanly from the sapwood beneath, peeling away in flexible sheets that could be rolled and carried without cracking. Miss the window by even a few weeks, and the bark locked back against the wood, splitting and tearing rather than yielding in clean panels. The frame itself rose in a logical sequence. Vertical posts were planted in pairs along two parallel lines, spaced 20 feet apart, narrow enough to span with available rafters, wide enough to accommodate a 10-foot central aisle with 5-foot sleeping platforms along each wall. Post pairs were positioned every 20 feet down the length, creating modular compartments that could extend the structure to 30, 60, 100, or even 200 feet, depending on the size of the extended family group. Cross beams connected the post tops, forming a rectangular skeleton. Then the flexible saplings were bent from one side to the other, lashed at the peak, creating that signature barrel vault, a rounded roof profile that was not decorative, but thermal engineering, something we'll come back to. Every connection in that entire frame was held together not by nails, not by wooden pegs, not by notched joints, but by strips of bark cordage, typically basswood or hickory, braided into rope and wrapped in precise patterns around each joint. And this is the part that surprises most people, because it seems like the weakest possible choice until you think about what winter actually does to a building. Wood contracts in cold and expands in warmth. Frozen ground heaves upward with ice beneath it, then settles again in the spring thaw. Wind loads shift direction constantly. Rigid connections, pegs driven into drilled holes, timbers locked at hard angles, crack under this repeated stress cycle. They don't bend, they fail. Lashed joints flex. When wind pushes against the structure, the bark rope absorbs the force through slight, controlled movement. When frost heaves the ground beneath a post, the frame adjusts rather than shatters. The entire building breathes with the environment rather than fighting it. And that dynamic flexibility, not brute static strength, is what kept longhouses standing through decades of seasonal extremes. Two lashing techniques carried most of the load. Square lashing secured perpendicular joints, vertical posts to horizontal beams, wrapping in a specific pattern that pulled the poles together at 90 degrees with each pass. Diagonal lashing joined poles meeting at other angles, particularly the cross braces that prevented the entire frame from racking sideways under lateral wind load. With the skeleton complete, bark panels were lashed to the outside in horizontal courses, overlapping like shingles on a modern roof. The orientation mattered. Tree bark grows with vertical furrows, natural channels that would funnel rainwater directly into the seams if the panels were installed vertically. By lashing them horizontally, those furrows ran parallel to the ground, shedding water sideways off the surface rather than directing it inward. A second layer of poles was then lashed over the bark from the outside, pressing the panels flat against the inner frame, preventing wind from catching edges and peeling the weather barrier away. The result was a triple-layer shell, an inner structural frame, a bark insulating and weatherproofing layer, and an outer compression lattice holding everything tight. 3 layers, no nails, no mortar, and it worked for decades. With the walls sealed and the frame standing, the Longhouse faced what should have been an impossible contradiction. Picture the interior on a January night. 10 separate fire pits burning simultaneously down the length of the central aisle, each one crackling and spitting, throwing orange light across the curved ceiling, filling the air with the smell of wood smoke and roasting corn. It sounds like everything you'd want on the coldest night of the year. And it was. But 10 fires burning inside an enclosed wooden structure also produced something else. Massive, continuous, lethal volumes of smoke. Carbon monoxide, particulate matter. The kind of air that doesn't just make your eyes water. The kind that kills. A single poorly ventilated fire in a modern tent can incapacitate a person within an hour. 10 fires burning simultaneously inside a structure housing 100 people should have been a death sentence. Here's why it wasn't. Above each hearth, the builders cut a smoke hole through the roof, but not simply left open, which would have solved one problem while creating another, essentially punching 10 holes in the only barrier between the occupants and winter outside. Each smoke hole was fitted with an adjustable bark panel that could be propped open wide, closed nearly shut, or angled to account for wind direction. This was not a passive system, it was an active one. The person tending each fire also managed their corresponding smoke hole, reading draft conditions, and adjusting the flap in real time. Every fire had a keeper. Every keeper watched the sky as much as the flame. But ventilation alone wasn't the full answer. The real solution was in the geometry of the roof itself. The barrel vault ceiling rose 20 feet from floor to peak. The living area occupied only the lower 12 feet of that volume. Above that stretched an 8-foot void, where smoke accumulated in a slow-moving blanket, gradually working toward the exit holes, while the people below lived beneath it, not inside it. Warm air rising near the fires followed the curved ceiling back down toward the outer walls, creating a circulation loop that kept heat cycling through the occupied zone. The smoke went up. The warmth stayed down. The system separated them. And then comes the twist that reframes everything. All that smoke in the rafters, the haze that made the interior perpetually dim and eye-stinging, was not a flaw the Haudenosaunee tolerated. It was a feature they designed around. Braided corn, bean sacks, dried fish, medicinal herbs, everything needed to survive until spring, hung directly in the smoke zone. Because smoke cures food. Its chemical compounds inhibit bacterial growth, repel insects, and extend the edible life of stored provisions by months. The Longhouse didn't have a refrigerator. It was a refrigerator. They didn't solve the smoke problem. They hired it. Heat generation went further still. A resting adult body produces roughly 100 watts of thermal energy. Multiply that by 100 people sleeping in close proximity, and you have 10,000 watts of passive, continuous heat generated by the occupants themselves. During the coldest months, families deliberately slept huddled together near the hearth pits, not just for comfort, but because their bodies were part of the heating system. The Longhouse didn't just shelter people from the cold. It used people as fuel. Everything described so far, the bent saplings, the bark panels, the smoke layer, the adjustable vents, all of it was engineering in service of something larger than shelter. Because the Longhouse wasn't designed simply to keep people warm. It was designed to keep people together. And the way it organized that togetherness turned out to be one of the most sophisticated social systems ever built into a physical structure. Each 20-foot section housed 2 families, not random families, but families connected through the female line. The same matrilineal clan, the same ancestral identity traced back through mothers and grandmothers. When a man married, he didn't bring his wife home. He left his own Longhouse and moved into hers. His children belonged not to his clan, but to their mothers. And presiding over all of it, over food distribution, labor assignment, and the management of every resource under that curved roof, was the clan mother. The most powerful person in the Longhouse was never the strongest warrior. It was the woman who decided who ate first when food was scarce, and who went hungry when it wasn't enough. That was real power, the kind that kept people alive through February. The architecture reinforced this authority in a way that was almost mechanical. When a daughter married, her husband moved in, and the Longhouse grew. A new compartment added, the building literally extending itself to absorb another family into the clan. The Longhouse was not a fixed monument. It was a living document of the family's history, written in wood and bark, edited continuously by the women who managed it. This elastic quality made it fundamentally different from the rigid stone structures being built in Europe at the same time, where the building determined how many people could live inside it, rather than the other way around. But the architecture didn't stop at the walls of a single structure. The Haudenosaunee took the logic of the Longhouse and scaled it to a confederation of nations. The 5 original nations, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, were conceptualized as a single enormous longhouse stretching across the territory from east to west. The Mohawk became the keepers of the eastern door. The Seneca became the keepers of the western door. The Onondaga, at the geographic center, became the keepers of the central fire, hosting the Grand Council and maintaining the wampum belts that recorded every agreement the Confederacy ever made. This was not metaphor used loosely for political convenience. It was a governing philosophy derived directly from lived architectural experience. They knew that people on opposite walls of the same structure shared fire, shared smoke, shared food, and survived together or not at all. They took that knowledge and built a government out of it. Decisions required consensus between elder and younger brother nations, mirroring the balance between the two sides of a physical longhouse. Some historians argue this structure of participatory governance influenced the framers of the American Constitution. Whether that direct influence can be proven, the principle stands alone. A people who spent centuries learning to share scarce winter resources under one curved roof developed an instinct for collective decision-making that most political systems still struggle to achieve. The Vikings built longhouses too, with the same basic geometry: long, narrow, communal. But they vented smoke through simple holes, without the adjustable flap system, without the smoke zone food preservation, without the integrated thermal design. They solved the cold. The Haudenosaunee solved the cold, the smoke, the food storage, the social hierarchy, and the political structure, all from the same bent saplings harvested in a single spring season. Come back to that January night, snow pressing against bark walls, wind working at every seam, looking for a way in. Inside, firelight moves across sleeping faces. Corn hangs in the rafters, curing slowly in the smoke. Children sleep on raised platforms, a foot above the frozen earth, wrapped in fur, warm. The fires burn low but steady, tended by someone who never fully sleeps, who watches the draft, adjusts the vent, feeds another log from the dry stack beneath the sleeping platform without waking anyone. Outside, the temperature is brutal. Inside, the system holds. Not because anyone got lucky, because every single element of that building was doing at least two jobs at once. The smoke that could have killed them preserved their food supply. The platforms they slept on stored their firewood underneath. The barrel vault ceiling that shaped the room also circulated the heat and held the smoke layer high enough to breathe below. The bark that weatherproofed the walls also insulated them. The communal sleeping that felt like necessity was also a thermal strategy. 100 bodies generating 10,000 watts of heat that no fire could have replaced alone. Nothing in that structure existed for a single purpose. Everything earned its place by solving more than one problem simultaneously. And that discipline of integrated design, of refusing to let any element serve only one function, is what separated survival from catastrophe across 6 months of winter, year after year, generation after generation. Here is what that means in plain terms. They didn't have more resources than us. If anything, they had far fewer. What they had was a refusal to waste what the forest gave them, a habit of asking not just what a thing could do, but what else it could do at the same time. That is not primitive thinking. That is sophisticated thinking that most modern design still hasn't fully recovered. We build systems that solve one problem and create 3 more. They built a system where solving one problem made the next solution cheaper. The Longhouse wasn't efficient, despite its simplicity. It was efficient because of it. That legacy didn't disappear when the physical structures did. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy still functions today. The Onondaga Nation still holds the wampum belts, the historical record of every agreement the Confederacy ever made, and still hosts the Grand Council. The nations still refer to themselves collectively as the Longhouse. The political architecture outlasted the physical one, which may be the most remarkable engineering achievement of all. Building an idea so structurally sound that it survived colonization, displacement, and centuries of pressure to collapse, and still stands. Outside, winter still rages. Inside, the idea of the Longhouse, life still continues.